Thank you. I just pressed record. Thank you. What Badiou noticed was that the movements of emancipation that took down Mubarak in Egypt, in fact, were brutally repressed by the state, in the same way that the 1848 workers' movements were also repressed. So in what we can say in the Badiouian framework, they did not constitute an eventual rupture, but rather they constituted an opening whereby the site of political possibility became a little bit more precarious. And that is, the state became more precarious in its totalizing hegemonic control. So these movements, at least in the framework of Alain Badiou, were something like a kind of sign of a possible event. Now, theoreticians have been speculating on these movements from all across the field, and what we want to do in this series is approach just what these theories are, and how do we understand the present. This is a task I think that philosophy has always struggled with, if one could say that such a thing is even possible. So we're going to be hearing in the future from Joshua Clover, for example, who's writing a book right now precisely about the resurgence of the riots and their meaning, both from a theoretical point of view, but also from a historical materialist point of view. And he has a book contract with Verso, so he'll be lecturing in 2 weeks. Following his talk, we're going to have a talk on the legacy of Ernesto Laclau and how we can use the model of populism that Laclau invented in his late work, how we can read these movements vis-a-vis Laclau's framework. That'll be a 2-part lecture. Then from there, I'm inviting other theorists to join, and I also just want to take a moment to say I want to hear from all of you in terms of who you want to hear from. You know, who would you like to understand and invite into this space with us, so that they might share their research, share their thinking. This could be activists, you know, this could also be theoreticians, philosophers, etc. So do email me and let me know, and email me any questions from today's lecture. So for today's lecture, we're very pleased to have the vice president of GCAS, Azfar Hussain, lecturing on a very timely topic, looking at a theme of political praxis in late capitalism from the reading of the 20th century seminal thinkers on post-colonial emancipation and Afro consciousness, W.E.B. Du Bois and Franz Fanon. So I'm very much excited for this lecture today. I want to read Professor Hussain's biography to you so that you understand a little bit about his background and where he comes from. As I open it, just give me 1 second. But before I read it, let me say that he will lecture for an hour, and then we will transition into a Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes, at which point you can all feel free to intervene, interject. Let me know first your question, or if you want to intervene from the chat box, and then I'll try to moderate. Okay? And Professor Hussain has been kind enough to share some of his propositions with us over email after today's lecture. Professor Azfar Hussain is Vice President of the Global Center for Advanced Studies and GCAS Professor of English, World Literature, and Interdisciplinary Studies. He's a very prominent Bangladeshi theorist, critic, poet, translator, and activist. He's also the Associate Professor of Liberal Studies and Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. Professor Hussain has been published widely in both English and in Bengali, And he is the author of the following titles: The Word, or rather The World. The L is in suspension. I like the Rereading suspension. The World in Question, Essays in Political Economy and Cultural Politics. The Politics of Sites, Subjects, and Scenes, Micro-Narratives and Essays, which is his forthcoming book. He's published widely on post-colonialism, Marxism, and imperialism. He has a lot to get to, so with that, I will turn it over to Professor Hussain, and please give a warm welcome to him. Thank you.
I think he lost connection.
Am I back now?
You're back. You're back.
I get the impression that we do not just use technology, but technology also uses us. So,
you missed your round of applause. We were giving you a warm.
Thank you. Thanks much. And thanks, Professor Dutt, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Am I distinct enough? At this point, can I check this? Okay, thank you. Okay. And thanks everyone for being here and joining the GCAS series on resistance, protest, and social struggles today. And I'm indebted to Professor Dutt, our GCAS Professor of Media Studies, and our organizer here for lending me support at more levels than he actually knows. So the title of my lecture today has slightly changed. It's Philosophy, Politics, and Praxis, Rereading W.E.B. Du Bois and Franz Fanon today. By the way, I should point out here that many pronounce Du Bois's name as Du Bois. It's actually Du Bois, and Du Bois himself pronounced his name that way, and we have proofs of that. So I have several streams in my lecture today. And each stream is my first stream. Stream 1 is titled Epigraphs. Let's say what reading I'm guilty of. I have 4 epigraphs to my talk. What constitutes my first epigraph is a statement made by Martin Luther King Jr. himself about the major African-American philosopher activist, W.E.B. Du Bois. Thus, I quote MLK, W.E.B. Du Bois virtually before anyone else and more than anyone else demolished lies about black folks in their most important and creative periods of history. The truths he revealed are not yet the property of all Americans, but they have been recorded and en masse for our contemporary battles. Dr. Du Bois was not only an intellectual giant exploring the frontiers of knowledge, he was in the first place a teacher. He would have wanted his life to teach us something about our tasks of emancipation, unquote. The second epigraph is from the African-American philosopher Lewis Gordon, who speaks of Franz Fanon. Thus, I quote Gordon, Fanon's philosophy can be summarized by a single conviction. Maturity is fundamental to the human condition. But one cannot achieve maturity without being actional. The word here is actional, which for Fanon is tantamount to freedom. Having built his thought on the importance of seizing one's freedom and taking responsibility for one's values, Fanon is careful to raise the question of how a transition could be made from neo-colonialism to a genuine post-colonialism, unquote. Now the third epigraph is from the Marxist philosopher, the Frankfurt School theorist, Theodor Adorno, who puts it this way, I quote, if philosophy is still necessary, it is so only in the way it has been from time immemorial, as critique, as resistance. It is incumbent upon philosophy to provide a refuge for freedom, unquote. And the fourth one is from none other than our comrade Alan Badiou, one whose work on the question of the relationship between philosophy and politics I will heavily, if not exclusively, rely on in order to advance my rereading of Du Bois and Fanon and today's contemporary third world contexts. To quote Badiou then, all emancipatory politics contains for philosophy, whether visible or invisible, is the watchword that brings about the actuality of universality. The actuality of universality. If all are together, and this is a crucial statement here, if all are together, then all are communists, and if we are communists, then all are philosophers. Unquote. Am I too loud or too fast or too slow? Audible?
That's very good.
Okay, so I'm just checking. I will check because this technology sometimes worries me. So, all the four epigraphs I have used here, one way or another, underline or suggest not only the relationship between philosophy and politics as such, but they also render the questions of emancipation and freedom central to philosophy itself, as they are central to the oeuvre of W.B. Du Bois and Franz Fanon, as I will argue. While further, the epigraphs taken together undermine or run against the grain of the elitist, self-justifying idea of philosophizing for the sake of philosophizing, something that the Latin American philosopher Enric Dussel quite some time back in a great interview characterized as philosophy fetishism, which even runs the risk of replicating the logics of commodity fetishism itself. Indeed, a whole host of what the Arab social philosopher Anwar Abdul Malik, one who is virtually unknown in the West, calls activist philosophers and philosopher activists in the third world, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That is, philosopher activists such as Sierra James, Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, Jose Carlos Maria Tegué, and Enric Dussel himself, among many others, ones who are not usually accorded the status of a philosopher in the Western philosophical tradition, though, have actively combated what has been called philosophy fetishism, while making the point that philosophy is not the territory of the privileged few, but that philosophy is for the masses, that philosophy is for everybody. Interestingly, this is also a crucial Gramscian idea. Although it is true that some of the philosopher activists from the third world I have mentioned have not always directly engaged the work of this Italian Marxist-Leninist theorist activist, Antonio Gramsci. In any event, the philosopher activists I have mentioned rather quickly enable us to posit the idea of philosophy as praxis. Philosophy as being actional, to use again Gordon's own word from the epigraph itself, from one of those epigraphs I shared with you. Also, Alan Badiou, in his provocative and politically engaged, politically charged philosophical work called Philosophy for Militants, has theorized at some length the idea of philosophy as action. I will return to Badiou's theorization later, as I would advance a kind of Badiouian reading of Du Bois and Fanon. But for now, let me make this preliminary point. Crucial as it is, both Du Bois and Fanon can be placed in the tradition of philosophy as action, philosophy as praxis, a tradition that centralizes the tasks of emancipation itself. But the questions are, What is emancipation? Whose emancipation is it anyway? In what contexts? And in what kind of a world? And even, how is that emancipation possible? I will again raise these questions as I will keep reading and rereading Du Bois and Fanon in the light of this idea of philosophy as action. I should also point out what I'm up to and what I'm not up to in my lecture today. By saying a few words about the nature of my work on Du Bois and Fanon is still my work in progress, a work that is not, in other words, not in a state of being, but in a process of becoming. While the ongoing work constitutes part of my ongoing book project, tentatively titled Decolonizing Comparative Literature, where I advance this idea, among many other ideas, that comparison itself is not ideologically and politically innocent or neutral. But indeed, certain comparisons can enable us to offer insights in the interest of the project of universal human emancipation, as it is to the works of W.E.B. Du Bois.
Can't hear him.
Yeah, I think we lost him. He should be right back. Hopefully he...
We should remember what he was talking about. So,
yeah. I just hope he doesn't continue talking, thinking that he's still on, right?
Do you have his number?
No, he should figure it out. I'm pretty sure he'll figure it out. Hold on one sec.
Well, I'm back.
Oh, good. Welcome.
Here's the thing. I should share this with you all, actually. What is happening is this, that I'm being disconnected. And then they say reconnect. And then I reconnect. And then I return. So this disconnection, this cycle of disconnection and reconnection and return right now.
Yeah. This is like...
And I don't know what to do about this except trying to do what I did.
Isn't this what Freud calls the return of the repressed?
It is actually in some ways the return of the repressed.
No, I'm kidding. No. Here's what I think is possible.
Anyway,
What browser are you using? Chrome or Internet Explorer or?
It is. I think it is still Chrome right now. I think it's Chrome.
That very well may be the problem. Chrome is not the best, but it might be too difficult to switch. So I would just proceed.
I have an idea. If this happens again, just wait for it. It takes only half a minute. Maybe we should factor. We should take this into account. Half a minute. Within half a minute, I will return. Is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay. And then you just say that, hey, this is happening, and then I will again take up some of these issues that I want to take up.
Okay, very good.
So I was talking about the project of universal human emancipation, right? And and saying that this project is central to the works of W.E.B. Du Bois and Franz Fanon. And as for the emancipation of humanity, I think I would do well to say a few things here, parenthetically. Should point out here that Badiou, in his Philosophy for Militants, very instructively shows us how Marx himself gives the name generic humanity to humanity in the movement of its self-emancipation and the proletariat. The name proletariat is the name of the possibility of generic humanity in its affirmative form, as Badiou himself points out. In fact, generic for Marx names the becoming of the universality of human being. So much for this parenthetical comment here with regard to the the project of emancipation and humanity. What do you mean by humanity there? But I was talking about what I'm up to and what I'm not up to. So I don't intend to, neither is it possible to provide a comprehensive critical evaluation of the entire range of preoccupations and pursuits of Du Bois and Fanon, staggering as this range is. Nor do I intend to introduce Du Bois and Fanon in an expository fashion, but I intend to reread certain ignored aspects of the works of Du Bois and Fanon, aspects that variously reveal the mutually enabling and even dialectically enhancing and nourishing the over-determined and over-determining relationships between philosophy as a battlefield, to use the Kantian formulation that Bois himself somewhat rehearses in his Philosophy for Militants, and politics itself. Politics here conceived of as an active force field of human interventions that underline power struggles, including class struggles, gender struggles, race struggles, and so on, in the interest of the project of universal human emancipation. As for the methodology of my work, I follow certain third world practices of philosophizing. Of philosophy not as a noun, but as a verb, if you will. Practices which have in certain instances, which have their Western counterparts as well. While I take leads from the Yugoslavian philosopher Gajo Petrovic, who, in his work called Philosophy and Revolution, provocatively asks, I quote him, "Must philosophy, read also theory, always be written exclusively in the form of dissertations? Read also academic pieces, where everything is systematically explained, argued, and illustrated? Has not philosophy, read also theory, already appeared in the form of epic poems, novels, short stories, and plays, in the form of prose poetry, dialogues, letters, and books of travel? Has it not been shown that philosophy can be successfully expressed in the forms of theses, as in Feuerbach and Marx, and even of sermons and commands, as in Nietzsche? Might one then try to say something in the form of questions? Is the question, pitanje, not the form in which thought takes its nourishment? Pitanje. Unquote. That was Petrovic. So I will raise certain questions and offer certain tentative theses and propositions in the course of my rereading. But before I take up the works of Du Bois and Fanon, let me return to Badiou's own work, Philosophy for Militants, to derive certain insights and even certain tools using which I can reread Du Bois and Fanon comparatively and in their interconnections. Now, I move on to stream 2, and stream 2 is titled Alain Badiou, Philosophy for Militants and Philosophy as Action. In Philosophy for Militants, Alain Badiou calls attention to the task of the modern militant in response to what he calls the total universal emancipation of humanity. But who is a militant? According to Badiou, who is he? Bruno Bostiels, in his introduction to Philosophy for Militants, provides a useful gloss on the category of the militant thus, I quote, "While ordinarily the category carries echoes of stomping army boots and the whole arsenal of modern weaponry, such vulgar military connotations need not be the most relevant here. Perhaps equally important is the popular etymology that links the Old Latin miles to milia itis or milia passum, iuntes, that is, mile-goers. We could thus say that a militant, simply put, is somebody who not only talks the talk, but also walks the walk, or who significantly goes the full mile. Unquote. In other words, who goes the whole hog. She or he is a militant in that sense that she or he is committed totally to this protracted struggle. Protracted. Now, talking the talk and walking the walk are instructive metaphors here. Metaphors that involve the relationship between interpretation and action, the question of praxis, that has also preoccupied a whole host of both Western and non-Western theorist activists, from, say, Marx to Lenin to Gramsci to Du Bois to Fanon to Freire to Bois. Let me note again, in parenthesis here, that the term praxis, along with the terms theoria and poesis, were first formally theorized by Aristotle, who of course takes his lead from pre-Homeric African, particularly Egyptian discourses. I should point out here that the history of dialectical thinking is more ancient than Plato and Aristotle, and that very history goes back to the earliest known forms of the Egyptian language. To put it very quickly and bluntly, and even roughly, Aristotle divides activity into abstract reasoning and practical activity. For him, abstract reasoning is theoria. He then subdivides practical activity into poesis and praxis. Poesis refers to all forms of making and thus artifacts, while praxis means the doing, centered in the activity itself, such as music, poetry, sports, even sports, and political activity, of course. Although I use Aristotelian terms here, I do not mean to Xerox Aristotle's particular schema for the reasons I will spell out here by relating quickly a brief segment of the history of theorizing theory/practice in the West. Even when, unlike Plato, Aristotle accords a certain value to practice, he nevertheless ends up privileging theory over practice at the expense of their necessary dialectical interplay. Somewhat in concert with Pythagoras and Heraclitus, even Plato before him, Aristotle celebrates the primacy and pleasure of what might be called ars theoria. I quote Aristotle, the best life simply is the life of sheer knowing, of theoria, and the life of practice is ultimately for the sake of knowing, unquote. This assertion is somewhat, one might argue, is arguably typical of the Greek valorization of theory, as well as subordination of practice to theory, of which not only Marx, but also Du Bois and Fanon, as well as Badiou's own Maoist-inflected Marxism, is acutely critical and contestatory. Indeed, in his satiric and sardonic tone, Marx maintains in his second notebook on Epicurean philosophy. I quote Marx here from his notebook, "The God of Aristotle enjoys the greatest bliss, theory," unquote. The Arab historian of dialectics, Ibn Ashraf, is right when he tells us that for nearly 2,000 years in the West, philosophic homage to theory, to the exclusion of practice, continued unabated, unquote. With the European Renaissance, however, as some third world theorists themselves have argued, the marked Pythagorean, Heraclitean, Platonic, Aristotelian, scholastic accent on theory was almost completely displaced, but was also replaced by a singular and even more marked accent on the value of practice. I quote here, "Truth was deemed as the outcome solely," and here the accent, the emphasis falls on solely. "Truth was deemed as the outcome solely of practice," unquote, as a third world sociologist of practice once put it. Just think of the devil of Goethe's Faust, and the devil at one point says, I quote, all theory is grey and dry, but green grows life's all golden tree, unquote. Well, the reason as to why I have so far parenthetically, quickly and even, admittedly schematically, narrativized part of the history of the theory-practice split in the West, adialectical as it remains in a number of instances, if not all instances, since Pythagoras and Plato, is to underline certain oppositional vectors and valences that characterize the praxis-oriented emancipatory projects of both Du Bois and Fanon, as well as Bois. Note, and I recall and recount this history at a time when the specters of Plato and Aristotle and Gaius Devil keep returning in different guises to certain areas of metro theory on the one hand, and to romanticized, anti-intellectual, even random high activism on the other. You know that there are people who say, hey, let's do something. No, right now, this is the time, jump. You know, so that's this random high activism about which I will talk later by way of using Paulo Freire himself, particularly the Freire of the pedagogy of the oppressed. This quick action, jump, without reflection, without theorizing, and so on. So, therefore, I for one don't want to intend to return either to Aristotle's ghost or to Gaius Devil, but rather suture back their terms onto a different and dialectical terrain of engagement. Now let me quickly take up Fanon here. In his last major work, The Wretched of the Earth, for instance, Fanon's own terrain of engagement is immediately marked by the dialectical imperative and the urgent historical task of bringing about change in a world dominated by 20th century capitalism and colonialism. Fanon maintains, I quote, human reality in itself for itself can be achieved only through conflict and through the risk that conflict implies. How can one be deaf to the voice rolling down that stage of history? What matters is not only to know the world, but also to change it. I quoted Fanon from The Wretched of the Earth. Of course, this is immediately reminiscent of Marx's famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Very familiar, Philosophers have so far interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it, unquote. One immediate caveat needs to be registered here. However, both Marx and Fanon and on other registers, Du Bois himself, do not by any means undermine the importance of interpretation in the name of changing the world. And say what Badiou calls it a thought practice. But all of them suggest that theory or thought, and by extension, philosophy itself on its own is even necessary, but not enough. And that likewise, practice or action on its own is never enough. In other words, untheorized or unthought action is even dangerous. For all of them, to put it simply, that is to say for Marx, for Du Bois, for Fanon, what is important then is this dialectical relation between theory and practice, a relationship in which theory and practice verify, inflect, inform, and influence one another in the interest of change. It is in the interest of understanding both Du Bois and Fanon's emancipatory projects, to which, of course, I will return very soon. I think I would do well to foreground another, but related narrative surrounding the idea of praxis itself, invoking Antonio Gramsci and the Brazilian philosopher of education, Paulo Freire. Let me briefly define praxis as an organic orchestration of theory and practice. Also, let me quickly talk about a tentative diagram that I have developed by way of drawing upon Eugene Victor Wolfenstein's schema to suggest the relationships among theoria, poesis, and praxis. So you have human activity on this end, and then there is arrow, it goes to thinking, and then there is another arrow, goes a little down to action. They're connected, and then thinking to theoria, that is just a theory, and then action leading to poesis, that is practice, leading to praxis. So anyway, what I'm going to do is that at one point I will share with you later, via Professor Tutt, this diagram. Later, I'll give you a diagram. Then it's almost like a dialectical calculus of praxis. And that very diagram might serve, I would argue, as a heuristic or even a hermeneutic tool for us for the moment. I think it's also useful to call attention to yet another diagrammatic equation that Paulo Freire himself provides in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed in this way. So Paulo Freire puts action up, and then reflection, and then there is this bracket, and then there is this equation, word equals work equals praxis. And then he qualifies that particular equation, saying, again, it's a kind of small equation, saying sacrifice of action equals verbalism, and sacrifice of reflection is, say, vulgar activism. In other words, praxis is, of course, neither theoria nor poesis in the sense of the production of practice, but praxis means an organically orchestrated complex of theoretically informed practice and practice-informed theory implicated in active networks of the production and exchange of what Paulo Freire even hyphenatedly calls reflection/action/action-reflection. Can you hear me okay, or am I speaking too fast? Slow?
No, it's perfect.
Am I muted?
No, you're good.
Okay.
You're great.
I'm just checking.
Coming in very...
Okay then, taking cues and clues from the whole of Marx's thesis on Feuerbach, as this text gets rehearsed, relayed, and extended in the works of Du Bois, Fanon, Freire, and Badiou, and others, let me emphasize that if theory, and by extension, philosophy, cannot recuperate, relay, enable, and be enabled by the energy and elan of practice, then theory or philosophy merely degenerates into theoreticism or philosophism to the detriment of radical social change. As Marx, Du Bois, Fanon, Freire, and Badiou all would agree, we certainly need theory, of course, not theoreticism. For that matter, we certainly need philosophy, not philosophism. In fact, we need this praxis, not practice divorced from theory or philosophy as such. In fact, the isolation of practice from theory or philosophy, or for that matter, what Marx himself calls Verwirklichung, or the reunification of practice in Capital Volume 3, is as counterproductive and even dangerous as theoreticism or philosophism itself. For the asymmetry or disjuncture between theory and practice makes each analogically replicate the general problematic of commodity fetishism under capitalism in ways in which effective change itself turns out to be nothing more than contradictio in adjecto, contradiction in terms. That being said, let me now return to the very text of Badiou, that is to say, to his work, Philosophy for Militants. In this work, Badiou identifies, for the sake of conceptual convenience, two tendencies in the global philosophical traditions. Two tendencies. For the first tendency, as Badiou points out, philosophy is essentially a reflexive mode of knowledge. The knowledge of truth in the theoretical domain. The knowledge of values in the practical domain. Badiou points out further, I quote Badiou here, and we must organize the process whereby these two fundamental forms of knowledge are acquired and transmitted, unquote. Badiou adds, I quote Badiou again, thus the form that is appropriate to philosophy is that of the school. The philosopher then is a professor, like Kant, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, and so many others, unquote. Badiou includes himself in this category while maintaining that the, I quote Badiou again, philosopher organizes the reasoned transmission and discussion of questions concerning truths and values, unquote. Indeed, it belongs to philosophy to have invented the form of the school since at least the Greeks. Badiou then calls attention to the second tendency, and this is crucial. Second tendency, asserting that, I quote Badiou, the second possibility holds that philosophy is not only a form of knowledge, whether theoretical or practical. Rather, it consists in the direct transformation of a subject, being a radical conversion of sorts, a complete upheaval of existence. Consequently, philosophy comes very close to religion, even though its means are exclusively rational. It comes very close to love, but without the violent support of desire. Very close to political commitment, but without the constraint of a centralized organization. Very close to artistic creation, but without the constraint, without the formalism. Did I say artistic creation? Then without the sensible means of art. Very close to scientific knowledge, but without the formalism of mathematics or the empirical or technical means of physics, unquote. That was Badiou at some length. Now Badiou goes on to say, I quote, for the second tendency, philosophy is not necessarily a subject matter belonging to the school, to professors, and the problem of transmission. It is the free address of someone to someone else, unquote. Badiou then offers some classic examples, and I quote Badiou again. Like Socrates addressing the youth in the streets of Athens. Like Descartes writing letters to Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. Like Rousseau writing his Confessions. Or like the poems of Nietzsche, the novels and plays of Jean-Paul Sartre, unquote. Again, Badiou enlists himself in this tendency as well. So he enlisted himself in the first tendency. He's a professor, all right, but he's also in the second, enlists himself in the second tendency, thinking that his, predecessors are Socrates and Rousseau, and so on, because he doesn't belong to the school, but he belongs to the school again. Badiou enlists himself thus, while ardently declaring, I quote Badiou, in the second view of things, philosophy is no more knowledge than it is knowledge of knowledge. It is an action, unquote. The two tendencies, as Badiou himself suggests, cannot, however, always be unproblematically, neatly or mechanically separated stricto sensu, for there are philosophers who combine both tendencies, or who gravitate back and forth between those two tendencies. Like there are third world philosophers, activists who are professors, who are there in academia, but who are also organized activists, who organize themselves, activists, go out, with the masses, part of their struggles, and so on and so forth. So they gravitate back and forth between these two tendencies. Alain Badiou himself is a clearing case in point, I would argue. Even W. Du Bois and to an extent Frantz Fanon combine those two tendencies in some ways. But it's also true, W. Du Bois himself was a professor, but he was also, an activist in the hardest sense of the word, always in the streets too. And same is the case with Frantz Fanon. He was a psychiatrist and he was at that institution, but his work was produced in the thick of this Algerian revolution. It's the Algerian National Liberation Movement, to be more specific, But it is also true that Du Bois and Fanon tend to belong more decisively than otherwise to the second tendency, in particular, a tendency that reckons philosophy as action, philosophy as praxis. It is not for nothing that Du Bois was an ardent admirer of Rousseau, one who belongs to the second tendency according to Badiou, while Fanon was at least partly influenced by Sartre, by Sartre's existentialist Marxism, that is. In fact, Sartre wrote that famous foreword to Fanon's last major work called The Wretched of the Earth, that the text that is fundamentally, if not exclusively, the basis of a number of my own observations surrounding what I wish to call Fanon's emancipatory philosophy of decolonization. Let me now zero in on yet another Badiouesque point. It is about philosophy as action again, amounting to philosophy as corrupting the youth. When speaking of the second tendency in his book, Philosophy for Militants, Badiou maintains, and I quote, "We could say that what identifies philosophy are not the rules of discourse, but the singularity of an act. It is this act that the enemies of Socrates designed as corrupting the youth. And as you know, this is the reason Socrates was condemned to death. To corrupt the youth is, after all, a very apt name to designate the philosophical act." Let me repeat, to corrupt the youth is, after all, a very apt name to designate the philosophical act, provided that we understand the meaning of corruption. To corrupt here means to teach the possibility of refusing all blind submission to established opinions. To corrupt means to give the youth certain means to change their opinion with regard to social norms, to substitute debate and rational critique for imitation and approval, and even, if the question is a matter of principle, to substitute reward for obedience. But this reward is neither spontaneous nor aggressive, to the extent that it is the consequence of principles and critique offered for discussions of all, unquote. That was Badiou at some length. Indeed, these words of Badiou, I argue, apply extremely appropriately to the entire works of both W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon, who indeed corrupted the youth by inciting them to confront, challenge, critique, and combat the existing systems and structures of oppression and exploitation, which include not only racism and Eurocentrism, but also capitalism and imperialism, profoundly interconnected as they all are. Badiou clearly underlines and accentuates critique and revolt with regard to what he himself calls philosophy as action, while the Latin American philosopher of liberation, Enrique Dussel, provocatively asks, and I quote, "What's philosophy after all if it does not provide, prompt, enable, and enhance critiques and revolts?" Question mark and unquote. Now I move on to stream 3, and stream 3 is called Du Bois and Fanon as philosophers of emancipation. Du Bois and Fanon as philosophers of emancipation. So let me return to certain areas of interrogations and interventions of W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon. First, Du Bois and a certain space clearing, drawing on, yet ranging beyond, two remarkable, yet underengaged, even ignored works by the African-American scholar-activist Rayland Rabata, works such as Africana Critical Theory, Du Bois's Dialectics, and forms of feminism, I will chart out certain relevant contours and coordinates of Du Bois's and Fanon's anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-imperial, anti-racist, and anti-patriarchal philosophy of emancipation. Indeed, the African Holocaust and anti-colonial struggle, Pan-Africanism, and the peace movement, Marxism, and even feminism, the African-American struggle for human and civil rights, intellectual admiration for Frederick Douglass and others belonging to the tradition of Frederick Douglass, disputations with Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey, a stimulatingly interdisciplinary and eclectic melange and ensemble of critical and philosophical ideas and interests unfolds across the landscape of W.B. Du Bois's life and work. For many, he represents one of the most critical and even contradictory race theorists in the 20th century. Others argue that he is the founder of Pan-Africanism and a veritable pioneering architect of anti-colonial theory and praxis. For others, such as Cedric Robinson, the author of that sensational book called Black Marxism, Du Bois was one of the most sophisticated Marxist theorists who exemplarily demonstrated and mobilized the class-race dialectics in the context of the American history of racism. Although his work, to quote Robinson, Cedric Robinson, I argue, had origins independent of the impulses of Western liberal and radical thought, unquote. Still others, such as Joy James, Beverly Guy Sheftall, Cheryl Townsend Gilkes, and Nellie McKay, just to mention but a few, contend that Du Bois' own name, along with that of Frederick Douglass, belongs to that very short list of men who openly advocated gender equality and spoke out against male domination and discrimination against women, to say the least. As Roland Rebecca rightly points out, I quote, his work, in many senses similar to that of the Caribbean theorist, critic, activist, C.L.R. James, and of course Franz Fanon, and due no doubt to his highly porous nature, has been critically analyzed and appropriated by scores of academics and political activists who harbor harrowingly different intellectual and ideological agendas, unquote. Although Du Bois's thought took several crucial philosophical and political twists and turns in his 80-year publishing career, 80-year long publishing career, from 1883 to 1963, what matters most, I would argue, is Du Bois's philosophy of universal human emancipation, decisively predicated as it is on this oppositional praxis and struggles against at least the four macrostructures and macrosystems of oppression. Again, four, Badiou's four, my four, Du Bois's four systems of oppression and exploitation, macrostructures and macrosystems of power relations and production relations such as capitalism, imperialism/colonialism, racism, and patriarchy, profoundly interconnected as they are. And this philosophy of universal emancipation, based on and informed by struggles against all forms and forces of oppression by extension, dialectically involves certain particular sites of struggles. Again, the four sites of struggles, I will name here the four sites of anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-patriarchal struggles, such as land, labor, language, and the body. Land, labor, language, and the body. For Du Bois, indeed, the emancipation of humanity means the emancipation of the land, labor, language, and body of certainly black folk, as well as more decisively of the global subaltern, the global oppressed, from the tyranny and violence and oppression of capitalism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy, as exemplified in various ways in Du Bois's major works, from at least the souls of Black Folk, published in the year 1903, to Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, to Black Folk then and now, published in 1939, to Color and Democracy, Colonies and Peace, published in 1945, to Peace is Dangerous, published in 1951, to Africa in Battle Against Colonialism, Racism, Imperialism, published in 1960. Now, owing to time constraints, I have to skip, the details of my textual analysis of Du Bois's various oppositional, praxis-oriented theoretical and political works, on the basis of which, however, I think I have already advanced my major point about Du Bois's oppositional, praxis-oriented, actional philosophy of universal human emancipation, and it is this philosophy which brings Du Bois close to Frantz Fanon, the major theorist of anti-racism and decolonization, one whose work, The Wretched of the Earth, published in 1961, was treated as the Bible of anti-colonial praxis in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. One was evolving his Du Bois-inflected philosophy of not only decolonization, but also universal human emancipation in the thick of the actually existing struggle, namely the Algerian National Liberation Movement of 1956 to 1962. Is my voice breaking down by any chance? I heard some echoes.
You're now unmuted.
Coming through well from my end.
Okay, all right. Is anybody complaining that cannot hear, or I'm fast, or slow, or loud, or so on and so forth, all these things?
I think we're good. I think everybody's doing well with the audio.
Okay, great. I'm happy to hear that, actually. I'm towards the end. I will end. Let me take up Fanon quickly, and then I will move on to stream 4, my tentative propositions, which I will present categorically. Let me take up Fanon very quickly. The author of such oppositional, praxis-oriented major works as Black Skin, White Masks, Dying Colonialism toward the African Revolution, this Martinique-born Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist. I know that many of you might be familiar, of course, are familiar with his work. Some of you might not be that familiar. So that's why I am inserting some information here, bear with me. Those who know, of course. Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary whose works have widely influenced such areas as post-colonial studies, critical theory, race theory, and even Marxism. Rather, third world Marxisms, to put Marxism in the plural. As an intellectual, indeed, Fanon was a political radical and an existentialist humanist whose ultimate goal was not only decolonization only. He has been routinely stereotyped as this theorist of decolonization. Yes, decolonization was his massive, major agenda given the historical conjuncture in which he was producing his work and acting, rather. True, but he was most significantly a theorist of the total emancipation of humanity. Mark Fanon's own pronouncement here, and I quote Fanon, I, the man of color, want only this, that the two never possess the man, that the enslavement and exploitation of human beings by human beings cease forever. That is, of one by another. That it be possible for me to discover and to love humanity wherever they may be. Elsewhere, in fact, I should point out here that Fanon talks about how exploitation, different forms of exploitation resemble one another. He says that exploitation is kind of identical because it is actually against one, within quote marks, object, humanity. So the task of philosophy, Fanon adds, is to restore humanity to its proper place. In other words, he is talking about this universal, emancipatory project, universal emancipation of humanity. So decolonization is a means, not an end in itself for Fanon. You end colonialism, that doesn't mean that we will, emancipate ourselves totally. So it's more than that. So I want to emphasize that point. And then another point with regard to Du Bois, with regard to Fanon, and I'll compare Fanon to Du Bois very quickly. In fact, like Du Bois, Fanon contends on different registers that the full realization and emancipation of humanity is never ever possible without emancipating the land, labor, language, and the body of the global oppressed from those four systems of oppression and exploitation such as capitalism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy profoundly, even if differentially interconnected as they are. And I have to again skip a cluster of interrelated readings of various textual trajectories of Fanon's work, but I will go straight into certain categorical propositions concerning what I wish to call the Du Boisian, Fanonian, praxis-oriented philosophy of universal human emancipation. So now, if we bring together Du Bois and Fanon, while synthesizing their various ideas and insights, we can advance certain propositions concerning what I've already called the Du Boisian, Fanonian, praxis-oriented philosophy of universal human emancipation. So here is proposition number 1. Proposition 1. The Du Boisian Fanonian praxeological philosophy of universal human emancipation in the first place emphasizes the need for taking stock of the actually existing situation at both local and global levels, while also continuously underlining the need to historicize, avoiding vulgar historicism. There's a difference between historicism and historicity, the kind of difference that Walter Benjamin once extremely acutely theorized. Historicity has to do with what you do with history, history being a matter of the present, while historicism, there's a kind of determinism, as if past events are there and they always already determine the outcome, and so on. So that's historicism. But historicity, avoiding vulgar historicism, the need to historicize. Thus it's clear that such a praxis-oriented philosophy would not make any sense without a cognitive mapping of the world. But a cognitive mapping of the world is not a one-time effort. And I'm not just using Jameson's term here, stricto sensu. I'm inflecting it in the direction of some of the works already produced by some third world, philosophers, theorists, and activists, because the term cognitive mapping, for instance, was already there in the book called Social Dialectics by the Arab philosopher Anwar Abdul Malik. So not just Jameson. It is a process of continuously being active in the world as its contours and configurations, its needs and problems keep changing. Proposition number 2. Related to the need for taking stock of the actually existing situation is the need for continuously identifying and demystifying unequal power relations and production relations in the world, class relations, gender relations, and race relations, and so on. Proposition 3. The Du Boisian Fanonian philosophy of universal human emancipation, however, holds that the act of identifying unequal power relations and unequal production relations calls for an emancipatory theory. Indeed, without an articulated theory, identification and even naming are impossible, while the act of naming contributes to articulating an emancipatory theory itself. Proposition number 4. But as the Boisian Fanonian praxis-oriented philosophy of universal human emancipation suggests, logos or theoria does not fall from the sky, to use Mano's favorite metaphor, but that it is historically produced and materially overdetermined. Thus, for the Du Boisian Fanonian philosophy of human emancipation, the relationship between theory and practice and the ways in which that relationship is enacted are all materially overdetermined, historically specific, and ideologically inflected. It is in this sense that the theory-practice relationship itself turns out to be an arena of ideological struggle, class struggle, gender struggle, race struggle, and so on. Proposition number 5, the Du Boisian Fanonian philosophy of universal human emancipation then enables us to forge such theories and practices as are capable of challenging systems of oppression and exploitation, while also enabling us to demystify such theories and practices as are complicit in and reproductive of those systems of oppression and exploitation. Thus, an emancipatory philosophy, for instance, enables us to see the distinction between Mao's going where? A question Mao Zedong himself asked in his own poem, and Microsoft's where are you going today? Proposition 6. The Du Boisian Fanonian philosophy of universal human emancipation emphasizes the dialectics as a mode and methodology of theorizing and acting in ways in which parts are not mistaken for the whole, nor is the whole mistaken for the part. But parts are considered constitutive of the whole, as much as the whole remains constitutive of the parts. Also, for an emancipatory praxis, a dialectical mode of operation emphasizes a conscious accounting of structured or systemic intersections as well as contingent and systemic discontinuities and conflicts that together constitute a dynamic and differentiated totality as opposed to a homogenizing and falsely synthesizing totality. Insofar as the question which dialectics keeps haunting the field of theory and practice, like almost inexorcisable specters, let us recall then part of Marx's postface to the second edition of Capital, and I quote Marx. It, that is to say the dialectic, is a scandal and an abomination to the bourgeoisie and its doctrinaire spokesman, because dialectics includes in its positive understanding of what exists a simultaneous recognition of its negation, its inevitable destruction, because it regards every historically developed form as being in a fluid state, in motion, and therefore grasps its transient aspect as well. And because it does not let itself be impressed by anything being in its essence critical and revolutionary, unquote. Proposition number 7, the Du Boisian Fanonian philosophy of universal human emancipation emphasizes the materiality of the relationship between theory and practice in certain specific senses. In order for theory to become material, and for that matter, even for practice to become material, they need to grip the masses, as the black feminist poet Audre Lorde would say, I quote, touch every aspect of human existence, unquote, in such a way that one learns how to identify contradictions in day-to-day life, as in the act of cutting onions or producing coffee and so on, and thus one learns how to combat in organized groups unequal production relations and power relations on a daily basis. It is in this sense that the underground communist poet, Arab poet, Akhtar, emphasizes the need for dirting dialectics in the mud and the water of the land, or that the Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, in his poem called I Wish the Woodcutter Would Wake Up, draws our attention to the daily dirty dialectics of the proletariat's life, to what Neruda calls the history of mud and sweat. I can't resist the temptation of telling you that, or rather sharing with you this fact, that I have a poem myself. It's called Dhaka and Dirty Dialectics, inspired by Pablo Neruda and the Arab poet El Akhtar and Audre Lorde. And that poem is online if you are interested in checking out. It's online. If you Google Dhaka and Dirty Dialectics, it's a long prose poem that takes up some of the points I just mentioned, some of the points that I've just taken up in the preceding two theses or propositions. All right, now proposition number 8, and then I have 2 propositions, short propositions, and then I will read a small poem, and then I'm done. But the process of dirting dialectics in the mud and the water of the land, or in the history of mud and sweat, is not necessarily a spontaneous and automatic one. It calls for continuous transcoding and translation, various time and context-specific lines of mediation and modes of organically tempering theory and practice by the deep specificities of sites and subjects. For instance, a Bengali peasant internalizes Marx's theory of value by drawing a circle in her courtyard, wherein she keeps her mud-drenched accounts of the number of hours she works and the wages she receives. She knows them. She produces 10 seers of oil over a period of 3 hours while receiving nothing for the first 2 hours. Likewise, a poet like Roque Dalton, the communist poet from El Salvador, internalizes the theory of value by politico-economizing his poem called On Surplus Value, or From Each Worker the Boss Robs Two. And mark the title. I'm with you? Am I with you? I think I've been thrown off.
No, you're with us.
Okay, just give me 1 minute. Okay. Now this poem is a short poem, very short poem by Roque Dalton, and the poem is titled, very instructively titled, On Surplus Value, or From Each Worker the Boss Robs Two. And the poem is like this: housework by the woman creates time for the man to do socially necessary work for which he is not fully paid. The greater part of his value the capitalist robs, but only enough so he can live and go on working, pay with which the man returns to the house and says to the woman, I see what you can do to stretch it out enough to cover all the expenses of the housework. That was a poem by Roque Dalton. And now, proposition number 9, to the extent that the Boisian Fanonian philosophy of universal human emancipation continues to emphasize the mapping, charting, and graphing, and even mathematizing, subject philosophy reckons space as crucial and vital to thought, practice, and action, to politics and praxis. In other words, the Du Boisian Fanonian philosophy of emancipation holds that dialectical thinking involves spatial thinking, among other things. That various systems of oppression and exploitation, say capitalism, imperialism, racism, patriarchy, cannot function without producing and organizing their own spaces. That thus relations of production also turn out to be relations of space, and that the emancipation of the oppressed means the revolutionary reorganization of space itself. 10. Proposition number 10, the Du Boisian Fanonian philosophy of universal human emancipation, while attempting a cognitive mapping or enacting a dialectic of theory and practice or engineering a spatial politics, cannot bypass but rather enables an articulation of the political economy of material sites such as land, labor, language, and the body. In other words, this political economy of praxis, if you will, enables us to see how these four material spaces continue to constitute a totality of sites that remain subject to exploitation on the one hand, and on the other remain charged spaces of struggle against oppression and injustice. Last, but by no means least, is proposition number 11, the Du Boisian Fanonian praxis-oriented philosophy of universal human emancipation holds that there is no emancipation of humanity without the total emancipation of our land, labor, language, and the body from such systems of oppression and capitalism as capitalism, imperialism, racism, patriarchy, and other forms and forces of oppression, profoundly but basically interlinked as they are. Now, let me end my talk with a Du Boisian Fanonian poem. A short poem, it will take probably a minute. It is by the Guatemalan revolutionary poet Otto Rene Castillo. Otto Rene Castillo was burned alive because of his anti-establishment, his revolutionary voice. He was burned alive in his own country. And the title of the poem is Apolitical Intellectuals. Apolitical Intellectuals. One day, the apolitical intellectuals of my country will be interrogated by the simplest of our people. One day, they will be asked what they did when the nation died out slowly, like a sweet fire, small and alone. No one will ask them about their dress, their long siestas after lunch. No one will want to know about their sterile combats with the idea of nothingness. No one will care about their higher financial learning. They won't be questioned on Greek mythology or regarding their self-disgust when someone within them begins to die the coward's death. They will be asked nothing about their absurd justifications, born in the shadow of the total lie. On that day, the simplest people will come. The simplest people will come on that day. The simplest people. Those who had no place in the books and poems of the apolitical intellectuals, but those who daily delivered their bread and milk, their tortillas and eggs, those who drove their cars, who cared for their dogs and gardens, who worked for them, and they will ask, what did you do? What did you do when the poor suffered with tenderness and life burned out of them? What did you do? What did you do? Apolitical intellectuals of my sweet country, you will not be able to answer. A vulture of silence will eat your gut. Your own misery will pick at your soul, and you will be mute in your own shame. Apolitical intellectuals. Thank you for listening.
You are now on.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Oh my gosh. Well, it's thunderous applause. Thunderous applause. I'll have to, by all means, unmute yourself and give Professor Hussain so he can hear some of the applause. Thank you very, very much for your spirit, for this very sort of intellectually ferocious engagement. Yes, bravo, well done. And I want to open to questions, but I have a bit of a selfish request, which is if I could, if it's okay with you, begin with a question that brewed and sort of fomented as I was listening to you. So allow me to ask, I love this notion of how in the transition from the material conditions that Fanon and Du Bois faced, which were different amongst themselves, but maybe we could say at the stage of capitalist development that they both were undergoing, that they faced, maybe you could say, similar global coordinates of struggle. And one of the things I gathered from your talk was that they argued various preconditions must be met for the emancipation of land, language, and labor.
And the body.
And what was the fourth?
What is the body?
The body. Thank you. And it's very interesting in that sense because you have genealogies of theoreticians. I'm thinking the emancipation of language, psychoanalysis, the emancipation of the body, Foucault, right? The emancipation of land, questions of Marxism, right? And and labor, of course, both. And many, for example, David Harvey talks about the compression of space and all of those very nice points you make. Here's my question. You said that theory and practice is always constituted in materially overdetermined ways. This is a fascinating point. Now, is it fair to say that today's post-colonial intellectuals, and you use the phrase third world intellectuals, maybe, is it fair to say that one of the ways in which this overdetermination manifests is precisely in how identity and the category of identity still haunts much of their work? And does that focus on identity, is it outmoded based on the current development of neoliberal capitalism? Or do we still need to wrestle with the category of identity? Or are we actually at a stage now where things like the nation state, things like emancipation from the question, say, of land, and the question of those material concerns of the 20th century are no longer quite relevant? So is there a certain internal contradiction of how they construct the relationship between theory and practice, maybe that's not focused enough on a critique of capitalism? That's my question.
Great. Thanks much. Thanks much, Professor Tuck, for your observations and questions. And some answers provided by you in your own questions. So I will take up two things. First, let me talk a little bit about the questions of land, labor, language, and body. And I have argued by way of looking at Fanon and W.E.B. Du Bois before Fanon, and by looking at their works and other third world Marxists, in fact, as well. I've argued that these four sites historically have constituted the sites of struggles for the colonized, for the, if you want to use the word subordinate here, for the colonized in particular. Four sites: land, labor, language, and the body. For the colonized laborers, for the colonized working class people too, and so on. And these four sites involve other, of course, you say that, Michel Foucault's theory of the body, and also Karl Marx. When it comes to the question of labor, questions of labor and land, and then you have language too, and psychoanalysis, from Lacan. But unfortunately, however, that a lot of third world theorists have not been, and it's not just a question of identity, it's a question here of also the actual politics of knowledge production, which involves unequal exchange. Also the question of political economy, tied to the question of capitalism itself. There's unequal exchange. Like, for instance, as we know Foucault as this theorist of the body almost par excellence, but Fanon himself is a theorist of the body. And I haven't seen anything like, for instance, even our comrade Alain Badiou hasn't engaged Fanon much, actually. Then Foucault was alive and Fanon was working, and Foucault, I'm sure, was aware. He was in Tunisia. He was aware of the Algerian National Liberation Movement, and he didn't pay any attention to Fanon's work, despite Fanon was talking about the body. Actually, the body is very much at stake in Fanon's first work and last major work. First work is Black Skin, White Mass, and last major work is The Wretched of the Heart. So the body is very much at stake. He's a theorist of the body, among other things. I'm speaking of Fanon here. But Fanon is not known. Even here in the West, even today, despite this post-colonial theory and all that, yes, despite Fanon, we still tend to privilege, actually, Michel Foucault as a theorist of the body, and Fanon still is a kind of footnote there. So there is a problem of this unequal exchange, problem of the politics of knowledge production, which is not innocent, which is not just only a matter of, just identity. Just because he's a person of color from the third world, so he should be given attention, he's oppressed and therefore he can produce knowledge. I'm not saying that. That being said, now let me take up the question of identity politics. This is Daniel, is a great question. Identity, I'm wrestling with it. Now, identity politics, I would argue, is neither inherently bad nor inherently good. That is to say, it depends on what kind of identity politics we're talking about and in what context. But it's true that at a particular point of time, at a particular conjuncture in the history of colonialism, the identity, for instance, of the indigenous people was threatened, was even destroyed, actually, totally. So there was this recovery, as Fanon talks about in the Wretched of the Art, there was the recovery of that very identity, and then the question of identity was directly tied to even national liberation movement, directly tied to what is called this decolonization movement. How could you possibly decolonize if you do not bring up the question of identity, recover your identity, reclaim your identity at a time where identity was totally erased even from this history? Hegel says even that Africa has no history. I love Hegel. So again, the question of, I love Hegel for his other works and for his contributions. A whole host of third world Marxists, a whole host of third world theorists are still engaged with Hegel. But that's altogether a different idea. But so identity becomes then important. It is a political question. It is an important question. But today, actually, in the context of the US, it has become a pretty problematic thing. And this identity politics has become so identitarian that actual content of politics is lost sight of, is bypassed, brushed aside, other things are brought there, So there, this is a problem. It's something like talking about the, limits and possibilities of what is called, say, black nationalism, or the nationalism of the oppressed, not imperialist nationalism. Nationalism, as Ahmed in his book called In Theory has argued, has various configurations and various contexts, various forms and manifestations, depending on in what particular hegemonic historic bloc that particular nationalism is at work. So it's almost like, talking about or looking at the limits and possibilities of nationalism. The nationalism also at one point played a crucial anti-colonial, well, let me put it this way, at one point at least, in the history of colonialism, even nationalism, the nationalism of the colonized had its radical content and character. Am I really moving in the direction that you want me to take in? Because identity politics itself can be very identity sensitive.
Yeah.
Not that against that.
No. I think it's a nice direction. I guess one follow up would be this. How would you characterize the overdetermination in today's time when left theorists, let's say, roughly, look at the relationship between theory and practice? Because I think that's a highly interesting proposition you make, that we're all like, this Hamlet idea of the time is out of joint, which Derrida talks about in Spectres of Marx. In other words, well, no. The praxis is always out of joint. There's always something temporally we miss when we construct the relationship between theory and practice. We never get it right, and the challenge is not to remain in the cave. On the converse, it's not to pretend that we don't need the cave of contemplation and theory and so on. So I just wonder if it's not an easy question. It's not a straightforward question, theory and practice today, what are its contradictions? And I'm thinking that in the evaporation of identity struggles of the 20th century, perhaps in their wake, almost paradoxically, the category of identity takes on new politicization. But we have to deal with that. We have to deal with that in the academy. We have to deal with that outside of the academy. So, but maybe that's the point of overdetermination. Would you agree? Would you say?
Now, here's another theory and practice. Now I have to stop. My voices.
Oh yeah, you're getting some feedback. A little. Well, hold on 1 second. We may have. Speak one more time. I don't know if it's coming from you. Maybe somebody else.
Okay, let me see.
Okay, let me mute my mic.
This didn't happen earlier. Did this? Now I'm okay, I think.
We're now unmuted.
Okay, I think it's from me. So let me just say this. I'm going to stop, and I want to open it up to the floor for people to jump in. This was a highly stimulating talk. We could probably go on for, half an hour. But let's have 2 or 3 interventions. I know several people are commenting. We have a raise your hand feature on the left. If you want to just sort of use that.
Okay, I cannot see anybody. I can only see you.
Yeah, I think everybody has their camera disabled, but they have audio.
Okay, audio.
So they can jump in on audio.
Okay.
Please raise your hand if you want to jump in with a question. Please, we welcome that. I'm trying to make sure that I can see who. Okay. Now, Joy, did you have a question? Bear with me as I try to figure this out. Just one moment. Hi. Okay. Sigrid, you have a question. By all means, the floor is yours.
Yes. Good afternoon. I don't actually have a question. I just wanted to thank Professor Hussain for his stunning presentation this afternoon. Absolutely moving, inspirational. And I have learned a great deal from your talk today. I'm absolutely thrilled to say that also Professor Hussain, of course, is GCAS's vice president, and how lucky we are. So thank you so very much.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Now unmuted.
Thank you, Sigrid. Are there any other questions on the lecture itself that folks would like to jump in? By all means, please feel free to do so. And also, if you prefer to email questions, that's also welcome. And Professor Hussain will be sharing the poem and even perhaps in the next few days, the 11 propositions with us. So you can wait for those to come as well.
I cannot see you, Michael. Daniel. Where are you? I mean, the whole pictures are gone. I just all by myself. I don't see even anything. What did I do? How do I keep it?
I see my camera. My camera is up for me. I see you well, and.
But I cannot see. Last time. I cannot see you.
Okay, if you go to the bottom left where it says webcams and you press that, it should pop it up for you.
Bottom left or upper?
Do you see that? The bottom left. Bottom left,
I don't see anything. Upper left.
You may have also accidentally clicked the X mark on my camera, which means that I don't know how you bring it back up, but that's okay.
Okay.
Well, we have had about, I think, over 20 people attend this lecture, which was an excellent turnout. And just want to give a final invitation for folks that wish to interject with a comment, a point of conversation, a question of clarity, or a provocative question would also be welcome.
Hey,
Please go ahead.
Hey, Azfar, this is Burton from Grand Valley. I thought you did a terrific job. I haven't heard you lecture in a while. I don't really have a stimulating question to ask, but at the beginning, I couldn't really hear that well. My computer wasn't working. But I think you had a quote, and it was something about philosophy for the sake of philosophy replicates commodity fetishism. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and maybe...
Well, to put it simply, I mean, what is commodity fetishism after all? So to put it very simply, Marx talks about the fetishism of commodities. In fact, in Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 1, Section 4, I think, and there talks about this. But let me paraphrase that very quickly and simply as I can, that commodity fetishism has to do with being obsessed with commodities to the point that you forget actually the entire history of the production of commodities themselves. You don't ask the question, where are these commodities coming from? Who are producing these commodities? That is to say, there is this total short-circuiting only on commodities. So that's one way of looking at commodity fetishism. And philosophy, there is this thing. Also in literary criticism, we have this. People do this closed textual criticism. Why are they doing it? Where are they going with doing that? Other questions. And plus, how that work or philosophy is grounded in the world or worlded, that question is also left out. So that's actually like philosophy for the sake of philosophizing. It's almost like saying art for the sake of art, like there's this art for art's sake movement. There was that kind of movement. So it is actually Enrique Dussel, the Latin American philosopher himself, was very critical of that, that they just do philosophy, they learn theories of Plato, Aristotle, and then from Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger theories. But so what? That's the question. Is it clear? I'm having a little bit of technological problem here again, but.
You are now unmuted.
Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
I can hear you very well.
Can you hear me all right now? Barton, did you hear me okay? Barton, okay?
Yeah, I hear you okay. Inic Dussel?
Wonderful. Wonderful. Is there another question? Would somebody like to jump in with another comment or question? Please, by all means.
Yes, I'm back.
Oh, you're back. Good.
Yeah.
Did you get disconnected briefly?
I'm back.
Michael, we have a question from Michael Vassell. Michael, would you like to jump in and share your question with everyone? Are you having mic issues? Would you like for me to read it for you?
Sure, if you can.
Okay. Michael Vassell is asking, on the question of land, language, labor, and body, how do these four sites cut across every form of struggle, both in the contemporary and in the historical situation of, say, the 20th century to today? And do you, how do you place ideology across those four sites?
Okay. Now, it also depends on really mean by ideology. So that's another thing. But let me begin by saying that those four sites of struggles, also the sites of both oppression and opposition, may not necessarily embrace all the struggles that are there in the world. But the question for me, and as it was for Fanon and the Bois was this: how do you, in fact, make the sites of struggles, part of the universal emancipatory project? Yeah, the project of universal human emancipation. How do you do that? So that was the challenge. That was the question. But as far as the contemporary world is concerned, and to speak of the world is not just to speak of Europe and the United States, as you know, which constitute a tiny fraction of the entire world. And I don't mean to diminish all the struggles that are there in Europe and the United States, but to speak of the third world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where the majority of the people are located, where the majority of the proletariat, if you want to, majority of the proletariat are there, the majority of women are there, the majority of indigenous people are there, and so on and so forth. So right now, actually, I wrote a piece quite some time back, not quite some time back, 5 years back. It's called U.S. Imperialism, Certain Perspectives from, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, I think. And I studied, actually, lots of movements. And recently I have also studied movements, actually existing movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And there are thousands of anti-imperial movements, for instance, thousands of them. And we don't pay attention to these movements. No, of course we don't. There are certain movements that come to us via the media, the Western media, and so on and so forth. But there are movements, like Bengali peasant. How much do we talk about that? Bengali peasant movements, landless peasants movements. Now, landless peasant movements continuing in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, say in Bangladesh, in India, in Nepal, landless farmers. For them, land is the fundamental question. Land is the fundamental question. For them, it is a land that also gives them their identity, their dignity, and above all, their livelihood. So, land question is so fundamental. And if you think about also Palestinian movements today, land question is still fundamental there in a different context. You cannot really bypass the question of land. Today, in the United States, here, of course, the land question is so fundamental to ongoing Native American struggles for their own, say, if you want to use the word liberation there, So the land question, in fact, binds, I would argue, that binds together, makes connections. It provides connections among all kinds of struggle that you have in the U.S. vis-a-vis the indigenous peoples, Native Americans, Palestinians themselves, and then Bengali peasants or South Asian peasants there who are near landless. In China, too, absolutely, land question is still a fundamental question. So that's one way. Now, anti-corporation movements are there in South Asia, like anti-multinational corporation movements. These movements themselves have taken up the issue of this land, and they say, land first, talk later. And that is the slogan. And by the way, that slogan, in fact, very interestingly, has been novelistically mediated by Leslie Marmon Silko in her great novel, I would say her magnum opus, Almanac of the Day. And there she says, land first, talk later. Actually, there is a chapter there, fabulous novel, Native American novel by Leslie Marmon Silko. So you see the importance of land here and how it cuts across. In response to your question, Michael, all kinds of struggles cannot buy. And labor is so obvious. I don't think I need to belabor this labor point. Actually, labor is a fundamental question when it comes to the working class people, despite the fact that one might theorize in all sorts of ways the very meaning or significance of the proletariat today, who are the proletariat, and so on and so forth. Third world theorists have theorized, and here Slavoj Žižek has also theorized, and so on and so forth. So, labor question is fundamental. And language, again, in third world countries, actually, in a number of Asian countries, decolonization movement is an unfinished movement. Even if I don't take a psychoanalytic point of view, maybe I'm a little bit of, now I will say something that might sound a little unpleasant to some people. Once psychoanalysis, it's very crucial. I like psychoanalysis. I have spent several years of my life reading Freud and Lacan. of course, Fanon also read Lacan. Fanon has a little bit of critique of Lacan in Black Skin, White Mask towards the end. A little bit, Lacan. So here is the thing, psychoanalysis. So Frantz Fanon was in the middle of the Algerian Revolution, Algerian National Liberation Movement. So, and he was at the same time in charge of this hospital where he used to treat, Arabs, particularly Arabs, black people, Arabs, who were suffering from disorder, within quotation marks, mental disorders and so on. So he was a psychiatrist. So he was a psychiatrist there, professional psychiatrist, and also taking part in the Algerian Revolution movement. At that particular conjuncture, a journalist approached Frantz Fanon and asked him this question. So you are treating, they are all shaking, these Arabs, and, what are you treating? What is your psychoanalysis? And so on and so forth. Fanon answered by saying that, look, Western psychoanalysis is not our cure. Then he said, what is the cure? Fanon replied, revolution. Revolution is the cure, not Western psychoanalysis. And Fanon was interested in exploring the limits of Western psychoanalysis, not of course in Deleuze and Guattarian way, as you know that in the West, Deleuze and Guattari also explored, and tried to theorize the limits of, psychoanalysis, how it can be extremely reactionary and so on and so forth, limiting and apolitical and so on, and they go on and on. I'm not with them, right? Don't get me wrong. But I'm also suggesting here, given the ways in which some third world theorists have argued, Fanon included, Western psychoanalysis cannot take us far. And the question of language is not only the question of psychoanalysis, but it's a political question. It's a question of decolonization. As you know that the languages of indigenous peoples are already destroyed. If you talk about Native Americans here, their languages were already destroyed because of colonialism. Then we, Bengalis in Bangladesh, had this language movement. Famous 1952 language movement, where language became this crucial political issue for landless peasants and, working class people. There. Working class people and landless peasants together had this movement called the language movement of 1952 in Bangladesh, a movement that aimed at reclaiming this language on the one hand and on the other, a movement for equality, radical equality. Marxist-inspired movement. So there was that movement. So language is it was fundamental right from the beginning. In fact, Fanon's first chapter in Black Skin, White Mask is a chapter about language. And the first sentence that Fanon uses in that chapter is this: I ascribe a fundamental importance to language. Transform. And now, language today still is this issue. In Bangladesh and in South Asia, where lots of people are there, indigenous peoples, their languages are marginalized. So they are in the middle of struggles for establishing their right to their own language. In Bangladesh, there are tribal peoples, as they are called, indigenous people. They are in the middle of struggles for establishing their own right to language, because their language is, So you see what I'm saying? So how language is crucial. And the body is always already at stake. Think of racism, patriarchy, the female body. Think of the body of the laborer, always already, there, actually. To recover, actually, one's own humanity is to recover the body, to liberate the body from the shackles, from the tyranny of capital. For the, working class people, the tyranny of patriarchy for women, and so on and so forth. They even relate all these things. So that will be my answer. I think these 4 categories can be variously deployed in the interest of understanding, ongoing movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as well as also I would argue another layer, as well as in the interest of, some kind of readings of third world literary texts, cultural productions, if you will, third world literary texts produced particularly in the wake of decolonization. For instance, I have noticed this, that novelists such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez from Latin America, Nogubuya Thiong'o from Africa, and Akhtar-Zaman Ilyas, say, from Asia, just to take 3 examples, are consistently concerned with these 4 sides of struggles in their novels. And they show how these four sites of struggles continue to constitute the crucial sites of struggles for the indigenous peoples, for the colonized, and for women as well. I'll stop here.
You are now unmuted.
Wow. Brilliant.
Question?
I want to close at 4 o'clock Eastern, just for, then that will have been 2 hours. Kathleen has a comment and May has a comment. Kathleen's talking about land. May is talking about identity. Why don't we do this? Why don't, Kathleen, is your audio working? Would you like to jump in and ask the question? By all means, you're welcome to do so.
I can hear that.
Okay, well, let's see here. So maybe, okay. I think no mic. Okay. Okay, so let me read them to you, Azfar, so you can respond briefly. Land is critical, as is psychological colonization. Where does technology enter into the dialogue of emancipation? I very much enjoy your phenomenological approach and your research of W.E.B. Du Bois's inclusion of the importance of environment as part of total emancipation. And I also appreciate your focus on Fanon's concern with the psychopathology of colonization and human, social, and cultural consequences of decolonization. So Kathleen's wanting to for you to comment on technology, and then let me get this other question from May so you can respond to both of them briefly. On the question of identity, how does one form an identity that is not a reflection of the struggle itself? Meaning, how does one go about creating identities that are not a reaction to the situation of oppression, but rather identities that overcome the material reality that can go back right at the heart of that indigenous culture itself? Is such a thing possible? Or are those identities always already tainted by oppression? And that oppression becomes an integral part of the identity.
A lot of things I've just okay.
You have 2 minutes. No, I'm just kidding.
Number of things I've just and I will try to answer. I mean, and let me thank the questioners themselves for their appreciation of what I have done, actually. But as I've already pointed out, it is my work in progress, and I don't have, to be frank, any specific blueprint, for instance, or very concrete, how would I put it? I don't have always very concrete answers to, certain things, like how do we really form our identity and how it can be, and how we can overcome. Let me take up the last question. How we overcome this material reality, how it is not tainted with oppression and so on and so forth. I think here, I would say that it is important to pay attention to and be part of the struggles that are ongoing. And let's see how the struggles actually, how we negotiate, depends on how we negotiate the struggles. There will always be some tainting. That tainting is unavoidable because we are not immediately free-floating out of history. Even when Bois speaks of this event, it is not something extremely transcendental. Yes, it is a total rupture with the existing system, the kind of rupture that cannot be accessed in terms of actually existing discourses, common knowledges, and so on and so forth. It is a radical total rupture, but not at the expense of the situation. So I, for one, have already suggested it's important to take stock of the situation. And Fanon, in fact, has emphasized the need for taking stock of this situation, in fact, almost towards the beginning of his book, The Wretched of the Earth. So important to take stock of this situation. And you do not really just always form identity consciously, because your identity is formed in the process of you being a historical subject. So it is a historically produced, identity too. I mean, we don't just simply free float out of history. So the first question is it a matter of forming our identity? Or this identity also dialectically evolves, out of your interactions with the situation itself, out of your interactions, or let me put it there, out of being part of the struggles, then identity also evolves. And to the extent that there is room for conscious intervention, sure. Like, for instance, Badruddin Umar for Bangladesh thinks that he's a militant. And he identifies himself as a militant. And he has certain understanding of this, what it means to be a militant at this point of time in history, in a third world country, the biggest ghetto of the world. In fact, Samir Amin, the Egyptian political economist, in his book called The Future of Maoism, rightly characterized Bangladesh as the periphery of the periphery under global capitalism. It is the periphery of the periphery, the biggest ghetto. So in that biggest ghetto is this militant, Badruddin, identifies him. This is his identity. Is it tainted by oppression? Maybe, because he's not fully liberated there, So there is that thing. So the relationship between, if you want to use the word identity again here like this, one's identity and this historic block in which one is implicated is a dialectical block. So it's a matter of struggle, and then you overcome. Again, it's a matter of overcoming, but then you cannot overcome just like that. Also, you overcome through struggles. And anti-oppression struggles, sure. And anti-oppression struggles will give you a certain kind of an identity, sure. But there are no guarantees. You can always go back. There are no guarantees. So it's a matter of continuous struggle, and the struggle continues. And identity is never, I would say, in a state of being, but in a process of becoming. I would say that one too, actually. And now I will take up the question of, there is a question of technology, and if my approach is phenomenological, it might look like it resembles. But it's not just phenomenological approach to Fanon and, to Bois, But, of course, I value phenomenology. It's not that I dismiss phenomenology. That being said, it also depends on what I mean by technology. It's a great question, by the way, how technology plays its role. What do you mean by technology? Is it the technology of the self, the technology of the body? The body in the process of reclaiming itself. Is it the technology, say poetry as technology? What kind? What do you really mean by technology? Or is this hard technology that Baudrillard, for instance, in his own idiosyncratic ways, theorizes? Or capitalist technology? Of course, tools, technology might be one kind of tool. And the oppressed can always seize the tools in the movement of their own, self-emancipation, if you will. Right? And speaking of technology, I've been actually talking about technology. Can you hear me? I hear all kinds of weird sounds are coming, aren't they? What happened? Can you hear me?
That might have been from my, I unmuted briefly. I apologize. I think that was from me, but I'll mute so you can.
No, I'm saying that what I wanted to say was this. I have been talking about technology from the beginning. Did you notice that? And I said that we do not only use technology, but technology also uses us. So maybe, we need to be more in control, if you will, of this thing called technology here as a tool. Sure. And Henri de Franco once put it, not that I'm always crazy about Henri de Franco, the lyricist once put it, every tool is a weapon, provided you know how to hold it right. I'll stop there.
Azfar, I want to thank you so much for a brilliant afternoon. You really have inspired us, and such a thing is often rare to encounter in our field, in critical humanities. So it's a real honor to have listened and engaged with you for this afternoon. Thank you very much. We're all grateful, and we hope to do it again. I just want to say a couple of things for next week. I've shared over email the readings for next week. We're going to be having the poet Joshua Clover lecture. He's an activist and a poet and a theorist. He's a professor at UC Davis. He's writing a book on riots, and I've selected 3 essays. He's selected these essays, actually. And they're looking at world systems theory. So this is a very interesting approach of looking at global capitalism from a very, if you're unfamiliar with world systems theory, you're going to get a crash course in it. And this is the perspective and the framework that he brings to the table. So we can start a discussion thread on Moodle. I sent an email, so everyone should sign up for Moodle. We don't want to use Facebook for a number of reasons. 1, not everybody's on Facebook, and 2, it's too much interference with kind of the personal domain. And so Moodle will be a great way for us to have conversations following lectures and before lectures. So sign up for Moodle. And again, thank you very much.
Great.
Okay, all the best. Yes, others can join the seminar at a later date, Kathleen, that's correct. Yeah. And Michael says there's going to be upcoming GCAS union meetings to help with Moodle. Okay, that's very helpful, Michael. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Azfar. Thank you so much.